the first thing I want to do is show you how to prepare your MIDI for mixing by converting it to audio. And I want to look at two different ways of doing this. I want to talk about doing it as a stereo file, and then probably more importantly, or to give you greater control, would be using it as a multi-output or separating all the drum sounds into individual audio files in Logic. So what I'm going to do first is let's just talk about converting MIDI to stereo audio file in Logic. Now this is so very easy in Logic. When did they put this in? I think this came in Logic 9. But Logic has a feature called bounce in place. So the MIDI region that you see here that says drag and drop samples, I'll solo it just so you can hear the drums that are in there. Right, so that particular performance, I want to turn it into audio. Now, when I say turn it into a stereo audio file, that means it's going to create one audio file that looks similar to what you see on all the rest of the tracks in here. But everything that you hear in my drum performance, the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, and the open hi-hat, is actually embedded into one stereo left and right file, right? And that's okay if the drums are already mixed the way that you want them. So all the drums are in their place and panned the right way and EQ correctly and sound great into your performance. Sometimes that'll work, sometimes not so great. So what you want to do to do this, to turn this into audio, is very simply control click on the region. Oops, why did I do that? So hold down control, click on the region, and you'll see, if you've used it before, you'll see bounce in place up here at the top, which is what we want to use. But if you haven't used it before, you can go down here to where it says bounce and join, and then you will see right here where it says bounce in place. And the shortcut is Control B, right? Control B will allow you to bounce in place. Let me turn this off. So I'm going to click this, and I'm going to get this menu that comes up at the top of the screen. Let me zoom into that so you guys can see what's in this menu. So what it's saying is, hey, what do you want to name this particular region, right? So I'm going to name it stereo drums. And it says, where do you want this stereo bounced in place region to go, the destination? I'm going to say go to a new track. Your options are a new track or selected track. The only reason selected track will show up is if you select a different track before you actually go into this process. So I'm just going to say new track. Now it's asking, what do I want to do with the source file? The source file is this green MIDI region in the back. I have three options. I could leave it, which means it just stays as it is, continues to play in the project. I could mute it, which means the region stays in the project, but it just grays out and it doesn't play anymore. Or I could delete it, which of course means it goes away. I'm going to choose to mute it. Now, also, things and options that you have as it relates to the source file are things like, do you want to bypass the effects plugins? Now, this is an important parameter when you're thinking about mixing. Which I don't, but if I had some processing as I was creating this track already on here, let's say, for instance, I had some EQing and some compression and maybe sent it to some verb somewhere. If I don't check bypass the effects plugin, then what's going to happen is all of those effects, my processing is going to be written into the audio file. Now, that may be good in a stereo situation if you have this sounding exactly like you want it to sound in your project. But if you don't, then you may want to check to bypass those effects plugins so that they are not written into the file, and then you get a raw audio file without any processing that can be processed and mixed into your project better. I'm going to go ahead and click bypass, even though I don't have anything down here. Another option down here that's grayed out, it grays out when I say bypass effects, it's called include audio tail and file. Now, the reason it grays out, let me kind of explain this. So you see I have this region selected here, actually two regions. If I had a reverb on this track, once the audio playhead goes past bar 89 that you see over here at the end of this region, if I had let's say for instance, a reverb or a delay, that delay would continue maybe for several bars, just depending on how long it is, past the end of this region. And if the effect is on the track and I want that delay to sustain out as it does in my project, then I need to include an audio tail so that it writes an audio file past bar 89. But if I bypass my effects plugin, it's assuming, hey, you don't have anything that's going to extend past this point. We're just going to not even give you that as an option. So that's what that is. Include volume and pan automation. This is almost never wanted if your goal is to now take this for someone else to mix or to mix in another project, because any volume automation, fader movements, or panning movements will be written into the audio file, and then you'll have an audio file with dynamic changes in it that you may not want because you may want to automate it later. So I'm going to not check that. The final option down here is something called normalize. Let me explain normalize really quickly. Normalize takes the audio that you create and it looks for the loudest peak in that audio file. Once it finds that loudest peak, it either turns it up to 0 if the loudest peak is under 0, or it turns it down to 0 if the loudest peak is over 0. It takes the other peaks in the audio that are less than the highest peak, and it moves them up by the same amount that it turns the loudest peak up or down. So in other words, let's say these drums, once I create it, let's say the loudest peak happens at like -2. That means it's 2 dBs from 0. If normalization is on, it will take that loudest peak and move it to 0, which moves it 2 decibels. And then every other part of the dynamic range in there will be increased by 2 dB to go up with that. And vice versa, if it was over 2 dB, it would turn that loudest peak down by 2 decibels, and then everything else would be turned down by 2 decibels also. I'm not a big fan of normalization just because of the way that it actually processes the file using an algorithm to bring up the loudness. I usually try to control my loudness levels, whether I'm peaking or at 0 or what have you, by actually using compressors and good gain stage management, which we'll talk more about. So I usually leave this off, but it has options for off, on, or overload protection only. The only difference between on and overload protection is with overload protection, it will only apply normalization if you peak over 0. So if the signal comes in under 0, then it's never going to turn it up. But if it's over 0, then it will turn it down to keep it from going over your 0 dB full scale. But I'm going to leave it off. And I'm going to go ahead and say, okay. You'll see the playhead go across all the regions, and then it'll create a new track. New track right here is called Ultra Drums _BIP. And you see here, this track was called Ultra Drums. So it's BIP stands for bounce in place. And now you'll see this track stays, the region stays, but it's grayed out and it's muted. So if I solo this, now I have a audio file with the drums, right? And so I could either go ahead and mix this in Logic, or I could be able to export this all out as separate audio files to mix in another DAW, which I'll show you later on. Looks like I have a question. Let me see. That's the best explanation of normalization heard thus far. Cool. I appreciate that, man. Let's keep it moving. So I'm going to mute this, and I'm going to go back up here and unmute this region that was muted. Once you select the region, if you hit Control M, it will mute or unmute a region.